Thank you, Mark. It's an honor to do a presentation for CIS, and I would say doubly an honor to do it beside Michelle Malkin, who I've followed for a long time. I think her first two books came out when I was in college, which was a long time ago. Sorry. It was the first term of the George W. Bush administration. So the topic today is high-skill immigration. And there's been a lot of talk about it, as Mark said, about the merits of it. And oftentimes when you hear talk about it in the media, it's sort of considered to be an unqualified good. And my task today is not to condemn high-skill immigration, but to sort of give you a large caveat. So my own interest in this began with a paper actually written by Stephen Camarata and Karen Ziegler here at CIS. And I stole a couple of their charts, so I'll use that to explain how I was sort of motivated to do this. Oh yes, so before I do that, I should talk about the title. That sign there is a does not equal sign. Highly educated immigrants does not equal highly skilled immigration, and I'll go into why that is. But here's how I got into the topic. So what Steve and Karen found is that the share of new immigrants with at least a bachelor's degree has gone up considerably over time. So in 2007, about 1 out of 3 new immigrants had a bachelor's degree, and that's similar to natives who had about 31% had a bachelor's degree at that time. But since that time, there's been a considerable change. You see a lot more new immigrants with bachelor's degrees. It's gone up so much, actually, that now about 1 in 2 have a bachelor's degree. And natives have gone up as well, but they haven't gone up nearly as much. Now, you would think that that would mean that we're going to see some major socioeconomic improvement among new immigrants, because we know that education is one of the single best predictors of socioeconomic success, at least among natives. But when Steve and Karen looked at this, and again, I stole this chart from them, they first looked at income, and this is the same time period right here that you saw on the last slide. And there's really not much change here going on. You can see that both groups had their median income decline during the recession, and then they both went up a little bit afterward. But certainly nothing spectacular here that jumps out at you saying that immigrants have really improved their economic lot. It looks really very ordinary. This is Medicaid use. Medicaid, of course, is the welfare program for medical care for the poor. And again, you would expect that because we have this surge in bachelor's degrees among new immigrants that we would see less Medicaid use, or at least less relative Medicaid use. But we don't. In fact, not only is Medicaid use up among recent immigrants over this time period, it's up in an absolute sense and relative to natives. So they're all going up. So what's going on here? So basically, my first thought was, okay, well, what kind of jobs are these new supposedly high-skilled immigrants getting? Are they getting high-skilled jobs, or are they getting low-skilled jobs? So that's the first thing I looked at. And this table looks confusing, but if you look at the bottom 2 rows, you can see that among all immigrants with a college degree, about 20% are in low-skill occupations. And that compares to natives with a college degree, where you have just, I think that says 7% with a low-skill occupation. So a big difference even there, just in terms of the raw gaps. But what really interests me is the variation across region or nations of origin here. It sort of shows that a college degree in one country is simply not the same thing as a college degree from another. If you look at the top of the chart there with Canada, you see that immigrants from Canada who have college degrees do quite well. They only 4% are in low-skill occupations. But look down at the bottom of the chart to someplace like the Caribbean. So you have, there's actually a fair number of people from the Caribbean who have college degrees, but it looks like over 1/3 of them have a low-skill occupation. And by the same token, you can look at high-skill immigrants or people with high-skill jobs. In Canada, over 3/4 of Canadian immigrants with a college degree are in a high-skill job, compared to around 1/3 at the bottom there in Latin America. So obviously, again, you see this big variation, and the idea that just having a college degree means a lot begins to appear to be untrue. Another way I looked at this is I looked at a set of international test scores called the PIAC, the PIAAC, the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies. Incidentally, I'm not sure that other people actually call it the PIAC, but I'm going to call it that for our purposes. The PIAC is 3 tests: literacy, numeracy, and computer operations. And the first thing I did was not to look at immigrants, but just to look across countries. How do people with college degrees do in different countries across the world? So that's the next table here. So to try to make this easier to interpret, I have the scores as percentiles on the American distribution. What does that mean? Well, you look at the top there. Japan it's scored in the 62nd percentile. That means someone with a college degree in Japan. This is not immigrants. These are all within the country you're looking at here. The average college graduate in Japan scores at the 62nd percentile of the American distribution of college graduates. So America is at 50. Well, that's a pretty big difference. That means clearly that the average Japanese college graduate is more skilled than the average American college graduate. But what really is interesting to me is the bottom of this chart. You can see a tremendous variation here where the scores are really almost unbelievably low. Look at Spain there on the bottom right-hand corner. You see scoring at the 24th percentile. Obviously, a college degree means something different in Spain than it does in Germany or Japan or the United States. And again, if we were to have a high-skill immigration policy that just selected people by their education, then obviously we're going to get a very wide range of skills. Now, to get to the meat of the presentation here, which is the paper that came out this week, I shifted my focus just to the United States and compared natives and immigrants in the United States on these PIAC tests. And it was pretty obvious from the start that a certain variable was a large determining factor here when it came to predicting immigrant scores. And I'll get to that in a second, but first I'll give you the main chart here. This is the literacy test results. And again, we're dealing with percentiles on the American distribution. So if you look at that second orange bar from the top there, it says natives with an advanced degree. And it says 77%. So it's a 77th percentile. So native-born people with an advanced degree score at the 77th percentile of the American distribution. In other words, the average scores better than 77% of Americans. And as you go down the chart on those orange bars, you can see that as educational attainment declines, so does the score, which is sort of common sense. Getting to natives with just a high school diploma scoring at the 40th percentile. Which, of course, is below average, what you would expect for someone with just a high school diploma. What's really interesting, though, are those 2 bottom sections with the orange and blue bars. The orange bar means a U.S. degree. The blue bar means a foreign degree. So if we look at the section that says immigrants with a college or advanced degree, you can see that those who earned that degree in the U.S. scored at the 66th percentile, which is not bad. Okay, it's not as good as the corresponding number for natives at 74, but at least it is above average, right? But look at that blue bar, 42, 42nd percentile. Remember, this is a high-skill immigrant group, and yet they're scoring about the same as natives with only a high school diploma. This is a pattern that repeats itself on each of the 3 tests. This is numeracy. Now, immigrants do a bit better on numeracy than they do on literacy, but nevertheless, you see the same pattern that I mentioned. If you go down to the bottom there, you see 72 versus, what does that say, 58 for the immigrant college or advanced degree. Now, to computer operations, again, the same pattern. I call it computer operations. PIAC calls it, problem solving in technology-rich environments. That's a fancy way of saying, can you work with spreadsheets and email applications? And this is where the immigrant-native gap and also the immigrant foreign versus U.S. degree gap is particularly large. You can see, 34th percentile for high-skill immigrants. You might say, well, wait a minute, computer operations, that's a learned skill. Is that such a big deal? Yes, it is. Most high-skill occupations are going to require computer ability. And if you don't have it, that's a sign that probably the skills you bring in are not what people have made them out to be. Now, there's another way of looking at this, rather than percentiles. If you just want to look at the percentages of each group that score what I call below basic. So in a literacy context, below basic is something like functional illiteracy. You can still read, but you would have trouble operating completely independently in English. And you can see that among natives with at least a college degree, functional illiteracy is quite rare, right? You see those 2.4% there. But among immigrants, it's considerably higher, and even college or advanced degree immigrants, when they're foreign educated, have a fairly large percentage who are below basic. Again, this is not Einstein immigration if you are functionally illiterate in English. Even numeracy, you can see that foreign educated immigrants with only a college degree, about 1 out of 5 are below basic in numeracy. Now, for computer operations, please everyone just avert your eyes. It's not a pretty sight. No one seems to be very good at computers. Even a remarkably high percentage of natives do not have basic computer skills. But for immigrants, again, it's even worse. You can get up to 3/4 or more of immigrants without basic computer skills, even though they have college or advanced degrees. You might be thinking during this whole talk that it's not fair because all these tests are in English. I have 2 responses to that. The first one is to say, yes, it is. It is fair that they're in English because English is obviously a key factor in what we think of as high-skill immigration. To have a high-skill job, you need to be able to speak English in almost all cases. And if we have people with weak English skills, that again suggests that the high-skill immigration is not really what we think it is. But more to the point, I mean, you might say, okay, fine, but shouldn't we give them a little bit of time to learn? Maybe these are really smart people who are coming in and just need a little time. Well, what I did was I looked at immigrants who had arrived at least 5 years ago. So 5 years seems like a reasonable amount of time for a high-skill, advanced degree person to learn English. But the results really don't change very much at all. You really get the same results. And there's a limit to how much I can cut up the data here because the sample size is not particularly large. But even when I did this with more than 10 years, again, we just weren't seeing the kind of gains that you might expect. Now, what does this all mean in terms of policy? Well, as I've been saying really sort of throughout the presentation, it means that high skill is not what we think of in reality. And when you hear talk about this in the newspapers and from advocacy organizations who say they want more H-1B visas or any other kind of high-skill immigration, oftentimes we think of that as Einsteins. We think of it as tremendously smart people who are coming in. They're going to get 100 different patents. They're going to start a tech company that's going to change the world. Well, okay, there are a few like that, certainly. But nevertheless, the typical U.S.-educated high-skill immigrant is really nothing special. They're just run-of-the-mill college graduates. In fact, they're a little less skilled than natives based on the results here. And as for foreign-educated high-skill immigrants, they're less than special. Okay, their skills are around the area of natives with a high school diploma, or if we're being generous, maybe some college. But again, Einsteins, they are not, and that's an important lesson to take away from all of this. Now, I already mentioned that you'll hear sometimes people sort of tout the trend I mentioned in the very beginning of the presentation about more and more bachelor's degrees for immigrants. And I'm not saying that's a bad trend, but we have to take it with quite a large amount of salt, if that makes sense, because of that. So for people to say, don't worry, immigrants are becoming more high skill, even though we're not even trying to make them more high skill, I have serious doubts. This is also true of one program that I've actually seen defended on these grounds, the diversity lottery. As you know, the diversity lottery is literally a lottery where we choose immigrants at random from certain countries. There's minimal requirements beyond just entering your name and being from a country that's eligible. And this is not a high-skill immigration program by any means. Obviously, we're selecting people at random. Nevertheless, I've seen the program defended on the grounds that, well, we're not trying to get high-skilled people, but it just turns out we get a lot of bachelor's degrees anyway. I would be very skeptical of that, especially because most of these diversity lottery people are coming from third world countries. The idea that a college education means the same there as it does here is very questionable. Now, in terms of what might be done to improve the situation, probably there are many things. One potential example is using some kind of testing. Universities obviously use testing already. They use the SAT or the GRE. The military uses testing. The Cotton-Purdue bill, the RAISE Act, includes a provision for an English language test, like a real solid test of English literacy. Then the better you do on it, the more points you would get toward a potential green card. I think that's a step in the right direction. I think we probably could go further in that regard, potentially. But that's all I have, so I'll turn it over to Michelle.